Welcome, everyone, to Ese Teatro's podcast, Episodio 2. Today, we'll be talking with writer Julieta Vitullo. Julieta is also Ese Teatro's company member, resident playwright, and director of Ese Teatro's next big main stage production, Two Big Black Bags. We're going to be discussing a little bit about the film and documentary, La Forma Exacta de las Islas, and Ese Teatro's next main stage production, Two Big Black Bags. Welcome.
Hey Marissa, thank you for having me, and I'm excited that we get to do this again.
Yeah. All right, well, let's start talking about your the documentary that you did. I know that you also wrote a book, so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the history of that.
Yeah, so I guess it's good for our audiences to know about the documentary and the book, because this is kind of how it all started with this play that we're putting on in September. Mm-hmm. We actually start rehearsals next week. So these are kind of precursors to the play. First, the book. It's a book that I wrote as part of my dissertation when I was working. I was studying at Rutgers in the mid 2000s, and I was working on my PhD, and I was studying the fictions that were produced in the aftermath of the Malvinas Falklands War, a war between Argentina and Great Britain that took place in 1982. And there's a large body of fictions, books, short stories, novels, plays, films that were produced as a response to that war, mm-hmm. which is a very controversial war. Or maybe all war is controversial, but it's a very difficult topic for Argentines. And there's a vast body of work that was produced in that aftermath, and so I became interested in that topic. And when I had to pick a topic for my dissertation, I decided to work on that. So I spent a couple of years doing research, and I started writing about it. And that dissertation ended up becoming the book that I published in 2012. That's called Islas Imaginadas, Imaginary Islands, La Guerra de Malvinas en el Cine y la Literatura Argentina. So the Malvinas Falklands War in Argentine literature and film. And also as part of my dissertation and my research, I ended up going to the islands in 2006. I was very lucky that I got a grant from the university, from Rutgers, to go to the islands. It's not a very common destination for Argentines, because the Malvinas, the Falklands, are in the hands of the British and the islanders who are British in origin. So it's not a common touristic destination. You need a passport to go there, even though the islands are very close to Argentina. Uh-huh. But because they don't belong to Argentina, they're not part of our nation, so you need a passport. As of now, you can go, but as of 30 years ago, you could not set foot on those islands if you were Argentine, because after the war, things were extremely tense, and we had no diplomatic relationships with Great Britain, and the islanders were very reluctant to letting Argentines go in there. So I was really lucky, really fortunate that I got to go. I went for a week to do research so that I could write the epilogue to my dissertation that ended up becoming this book. And eventually, there's a movie that came out of that. So it's a long story. There's a lot to share. But that documentary, The Exact Shape of the Islands, like La Forma Exacta de las Islas, came out a couple of years. Well, actually, the same year that the book came out. It was released a little later, 2014. And, fast forward 2019, mm-hmm. I found myself writing about the topic again, mm-hmm. and this time in the form of a play. Yeah. Whereas before it had been, first this long form essay, talking about other people's views, on the war through their fictions. And then the documentary, which had, a more testimonial component and also a very personal component.
So when you went to, should I call it the Malvinas or Malvinas Falkland Islands? Okay. When you went there, or when you were planning to go there, what was the idea? Like, did you have a place that you were going to visit? Did you know of people? I think there was one part in the documentary that you visited a historical society, and you were able to interview somebody from there.
Yeah, so my plans were, I had quite a few things planned, tours that I had already booked. And my idea was to go there, visit these places. I was going to go to the mountains where the war took place and the Argentines were stationed. And I was going to go basically do all the walk around the downtown of Stanley, which is the capital. And my plan was to, and I was also going to go to the cemetery where a lot of the Argentine soldiers are. But my plan was to write an epilogue. So I was there to write a diary that was going to become the epilogue, which eventually, that's what happened. I turned this diary into an epilogue, but I ended up spending a lot less time writing because I ended up meeting completely by happenstance these ex-combatants, Carlos and Dacio, who were coming back to the islands after 25 years for the first time, because the anniversary of the conflict was coming up, this 25th anniversary, and they got funding from a TV show that gave them funding to go back. And at this time, a lot of ex-combatants were going back, so they were kind of part of this like wave of people who were returning just to get to see the place where they had been when they were really young. So I was not planning on finding these people. Like, it was completely by chance. And I did bring a cam recorder, a little what's the name? I forget, the ones with the small tape.
Yeah, like a video recorder.
Yeah, that a friend of mine lent me, thinking maybe I would see, either film some penguins or film anything, you know. But I wasn't thinking I was going to be using the camera to record interviews.
Yeah.
So that was a complete change to my plan, because I ended up following them in their trip.
And they were fine with this?
Totally fine. So my trip kind of became following their trip and their experience and bearing witness to what it was like for them to return to this place.
Yeah.
They were totally fine. Not only were they fine, but they welcomed it because they wanted to be able to talk about their experiences, and they found somebody who was deeply interested in their experience. So they were like, yeah, sure, come. And I was like, okay.
And it was like, wow, what are the chances of them running into somebody, a woman who was doing her dissertation on this, and it was an anniversary for them.
Yeah.
And when they were, when they had first joined that, the military, or maybe they didn't join, I think that I recall something about, a lot of families, the young men got pulled in, they had to go. They were very young. They were 18, 19 years old. Yeah,
most of the soldiers who went to the islands were conscripted soldiers. So Argentina at the time, we're talking about 1982, for many decades, we had a military service. So all men, when they were of age, age 18, they went through a draft process, and so depending on what number you got, according to your national ID number, which would be like the social security number here, you got matched with either we're going to go to the Navy, the Army, or aviation. So you, according to what number you got, and then if you got a low number, then you didn't have to go at all. So it was by chance that you got pulled into the military service. And in this particular year, it so happened that there was a war. So those conscripted soldiers ended up being sent to war. And the war was launched by a military dictatorship. So it was a highly illegitimate war. So Argentina had been under a dictatorial regime for several years. There was a military coup in 1976.
Okay.
So there was not a democracy, and the military regime was reaching a crisis of legitimacy at that point. So the military decided to appeal to an old national cause, which was the cause of the Malvinas, Falklands, Malvinas, we call them. I say Falklands because that's the name in English, but of course we don't know them as such. We know them as Malvinas, which is a name that comes from French, because at some point there were also French settlers there. So the war was launched because the military knew that by utilizing this very emotional cause of Argentines wanting to recover these islands for Argentina and feel like that the British were there illegitimately, people would support them. They would support the military because they were launching this war that felt like a just war. But they didn't send the professional soldiers. They sent the conscripted soldiers who had no training,
right,
who had no weapons. The strategy laid out was poor and improvised. And we were facing one of the greatest military powers in the world,
right,
Great Britain. So
well, and I think I read something about and mentioned to you, I think a lot of people in the the global world did not think that Margaret Thatcher was going to go in and do that.
yes,
and she did. And so
because she was also facing a crisis,
right,
so it was very opportune for her,
right. But going back to the soldiers and what they went through, and you talking about not being prepared. In that documentary, there are a lot of things that I recall that Carlos and Dacio were able to talk about, of basically how they had to take shelter, what they were able to eat, and how they prepared when they saw ships coming in. And so is there anything that you can recall about those situations? And I know a lot of them, that it got pretty emotional.
Yeah.
But I think those are the things that we need to talk about or know.
Yeah. So there's something very peculiar about this war. I mean, war is always awful. So I am against war, and this is why I studied this topic. This is why I wrote this play. But what's peculiar about this particular war is that the enemy for these young soldiers, the young conscripted soldiers, they weren't just the British, they were their own superiors. So the Argentine soldiers were treating them as if they were the enemy. So they were not just combating the English, but they were coming up against a very abusive, very twisted, very sadistic group of professional soldiers in the higher ranks who were treating them in a very similar manner as they were treating them back in the continent when they were doing the military service. So the military service was known for being this place where there was a lot of abuse. And if you see a movie like Full Metal Jacket, for example, and any of the movies of Vietnam, you can see this portrayed in film over and over, where the military are abusing the young soldiers, and it's kind of like there's these rites of passage, right? Where the more abused you are, the more you're going to go and abuse others, right? That's kind of what's supposed to be. But this took a very extreme form of abuse, actual torture. That is documented, and that at the time when I went to the islands, it was starting to come out, and veterans, ex-combatants were starting to come forward about the way they had been abused, torture, they had put in very extreme conditions of weather, cold weather, without the proper clothing. The weapons that they had, sometimes they didn't shoot, so they had a weapon that didn't work, that was not going to protect them. They were underfed, so there was malnourishment. So there was actual abuse going on. That's why I was interested in this. Well, of course, listening to the testimony, that what I heard from Carlos and Dacio was extremely valuable, and then it really stuck with me over the years. And when I wrote this play, was in the forefront, and when people come to see the play, they're going to see that this is a lot of what the play is about, is how to come to terms with having been in this war where you were facing not just this foreign enemy, but the enemy was your own army.
Yeah. Well, and you're also reminding me about the geographical location that they were at and how that also played a factor into this adversity and just the grueling weather, right? It can be very desolate, very cold, windy. There are not a lot of plants that grow there. You can just go and eat or find food, or even wildlife that goes there.
Yeah, it's a very harsh landscape.
Yeah.
And some of the soldiers who were sent were from very tropical climates. They were from the north. There were a lot of soldiers that came from the north and the northeast. They were not used to enduring this kind of weather.
Yeah.
Let alone the fact that they were underprepared because of the lack of equipment and clothing, proper clothing. So they were very rough. Even though it was a relatively short war, it only lasted 74 days. It was a really, really brutal conflict.
2 more questions I want to ask. So about their when the ex-combatants and the soldiers were all there, how were they able to get, what did they use for shelter? How were they able to get the clothes and the food? Because it just seems like it would not be easy to import things on that island. So when they came, did they bring everything with them?
Yeah, so the islands have a stable population. It's a small population, but there are people living on the islands, mostly in the capital, Stanley, but also in the countryside, what they call there the camp.
Okay.
But the military, when they landed, they brought equipment, they brought food. There were food drives there's like this notorious for having been orchestrated in a way that they actually never made it to the islands. There's like a lot of rumors that the food was actually being taken and never actually got shipped. There are a lot of there was a lot of foul play. But as far as the way that they managed it, they brought things, and the islands also have their own economy. So there's a local economy and a stable population of, they call themselves kelpers because of the type of seaweed that grows there that is called kelp.
Oh.
And they also call themselves Falkland Islanders. And it's a population. There's like 7 generations now of people who have been living on this island that were basically, for all intents and purposes, invaded by the Argentine when the Argentine got there. So my position on this war is not necessarily the most, I guess, mainstream. Maybe if you talk to perhaps an average Argentine, which is, of course that's a vast generalization, but like the more common position would be to claim the islands for Argentina. And like part of me agrees with that, but at the same time, the position that is less common, that I think I have a little bit of a different view on because of all the studies and because of the fact that I went, is that, there's the imperial history, the fact that Great Britain came to take these islands that are so far away, and this happened in 1833. That's when the British went to the islands and took over. But there was no native population before then. So it's not that they went and they decimated the population that was there. There was no population. There were no humans living on those islands. There was a small settlement of Argentines who had, we could call them Argentine just because the Argentina had just gotten its independence only 20 years before. Argentina became independent from Spain in 1816. So it was a very young nation that was still forming. There were still civil wars. So in 1833, when the British went to the islands, there wasn't such thing as a stable population. It was just a settlement. And so the people who have been there, who are of British descent, there's a lot of Scottish people who went there at the time, and then over the decades they got populated. They don't feel like they're Argentine. They inherited, and this is something that comes up in the documentary when I interview this journalist called John Fowler. They inherited a way that was the way of the gauchos, that actually shared a lot of similarities with the way that things were done in Patagonia. So there's actually a very interesting, very rich history. So they inherited those ways, but they spoke English. They felt that they were British. They belonged to Great Britain, like, officially and also culturally. And they don't have a strong connection to Argentina. Like, whether we like it or not, the islanders feel that they belong to these islands that are in overseas territory of Great Britain, and that's, unfortunately, that's the way it is.
That's the reality.
That's the reality. That's how it played out historically. So it's natural that from their point of view, they feel, they speak English.
Mm-hmm.
They were, in their mind, invaded in 1982 by a military government that was doing horrible things to its population in Argentina, and so they don't have a lot of good things to say about Argentines, even though I was very well received. They do receive people well, and they accept Argentines. It's not dangerous or anything to go and visit, but they don't want to be Argentine.
So the history, the cemetery that you visited, was that soldiers that were coming from Argentina, or was it the Great Britain soldiers?
The cemetery, there's a scene in the documentary, going back to the documentary, we shot this scene in the Darwin cemetery. It's an area of the island that is called Darwin, after Charles Darwin, who visited the islands, and when he was traveling with the Beagle, aboard the Beagle. So this cemetery was built after the war to bury the Argentine soldiers.
Okay.
And it's a very, very sad place because, cemeteries are sad places, but also because this is a war cemetery with hundreds of graves with that have the remains of these very young soldiers. Not all of them. Some of them were older, but most of the vast majority of them were conscripted soldiers, and a lot of them don't have a name because they were never identified. So these tombstones say Argentine soldier only known to God. So the family members who got to return to the islands to go find their loved ones, some of them don't even know what grave they are in because they were never identified. So it's a pretty sad place in a very desolate, windy, harsh climate, but it's also, I have to say, very, very beautiful place. And you can see the beauty, I think, and appreciate it in the documentary.
And so can we kind of jump over to the play? Two Big Black Bags. And so tell us a little bit about that and maybe what it's about and how, some of the pieces you put in there, you pulled from your experience.
No, that's a really good question because I did pull quite a bit from that experience of going to the islands. So it was, I guess, the inspiration, I should also say that the inspiration for all of this also goes back to remembering when the war happened, because I was 6 years old and I was starting elementary school when the war happened. So it's my first historical memory. So it's basically one of the first memories, because you start remembering things right around that age. And also my first memory of something that was happening that was outside of my family or myself. So I have a very, very vivid recollection of when the war was happening and how sad everything was. And so that's one of the reasons why I picked that topic, first of all. So that's kind of like the very long answer to your question, like, where did this play come from? Or like, tell me a little bit about the play. Like, I feel like this has been many years in the making, right? Because I thought about this when I was very young, and then I picked it up to work on my PhD dissertation, and then I picked it up to make the movie, and then the movie became a very personal movie because of circumstances that were completely outside of the scope of the movie, outside of the scope of my research, that had more to do with a personal relationship that I developed while I was on the islands during that year in 2006. But then so after the movie was done and the book was published, I felt like I had all these other things that I still wanted to say about the war and about the experience of the ex-combatants based on what I was able to witness while I was there. And so I found myself writing a very wild, very full of magical elements and surrealist elements script based on some of the things that were like, okay, I still want to say all these other things. Also because I didn't direct the movie, I was more of I wrote the script, or what we call a script. It really is not a script in documentary because it's not all scripted, but there's like some, you still write a script. So I did that, and I also was in it, so I'm one of the main characters, or maybe the main character in the movie, but I didn't direct it. So there were a lot of decisions that were not my decisions, they were the director's decisions, and this was the way I wanted it, because what I've mentioned before, and I think people will understand when they watch the movie, which I hope they do. They can watch it, find it through our website at eseteatro.org. I think that there were a lot of things that were left out because it was not just my movie. It was like a movie that was a collective project. This, however, is my script. But it's not my play. It's actually going to be the play of everybody who is in the team, which is what's so beautiful, right, about theater. So it's my script in that I wrote it, and I had full freedom to write about everything that I wanted, that I felt that I still had to say about this conflict. But then, of course, it's going to be a collective endeavor, because that's how theater works, and I'm so excited because we're bringing all these actors and designers, and there's all this the production team, there's all this talent put into this, developing this script, right?
Well, and I feel like after I read the script, and then, working with you on Fermin, and just understanding and seeing your style of writing, I just loved how you and please correct me if I'm wrong, if I shouldn't use these words to describe, but it just reminded me of like your experience along with your sort of your magical realism writing and putting that together, and I just feel like, oh, I'm so excited to see what the product.
I tend to write like that. It's almost like I can't help it. It's not a deliberate.
So like the main character, James, he's the ex-combatant. And his I don't
alter ego.
Alter ego psychic. Henry is along with them for this. So the overall story is that James lives in Seattle now, but then he's going to take this trip to Argentina, where he's from, and go back home driving.
Yes. So there's a bit of a stretch of, in terms of how much can you really drive in a couple of months? Would you be able to go through all these countries so quickly? I mean, it's possible. I did a little research on, how long would it take you if you were to drive from Seattle to Argentina all the way through? Of course, they stop and they have a lot of adventures along the way. And it is a play. It is not a realistic play. So I take a lot of liberty in terms of the journey, right? So, sometimes maybe 5 minutes go by and they're still in one country, and then a minute goes by and they went through 3 other countries, right? So I don't have to account to reality, because it's a very wild and surrealistic play.
Going back to the main character, James, he struggles, right? There's some mental health there, which is, and then there's maybe some alcoholism. That's going on with him. And it's so like Henry is sort of like his, I don't know, what would you call Henry? I mean, you called him his alter ego, but he is sort of like the one that's trying to always show him things and tell him.
So Henry shows up when James is not drunk. If James is drunk, he's suppressing his emotions, and he's suppressing the things that he needs to work on in order to be a better human being, a better partner to his wife, and a better father to his daughters. And Henry, even though he's young, the idea is that Henry showed up when in James's life when James was 18 after the war, and he showed up as a product of some sort of split. And this is something that the audience will figure out pretty early on.
Yeah.
That they really are the same person, but they're two incarnations of the same person. So Henry is younger.
Yeah.
James is in his 40s, and Henry kind of that aspect of James that got stuck in the past, but at the same time is the one that allows him to see that he cannot just move on without working things through. And this is kind of like, if there was a message, which I don't like that word, but if there was something that I hope that people will get out from the play, among other things, is that you can't just bury your trauma. You have to work through it. You have to face it.
Yeah.
And otherwise you're not going to be able to get to where you need to get. And so the journey that he undertakes is both a journey in place and a metaphorical journey.
Yeah. I also appreciated how you brought a little bit of, you talked about going back to the documentary Darwinism, and, and then you brought a little bit into the play. And then you also, and so I thought, well, there's got to be some significance there. And then you also, I like how you brought in the school teacher, because I also wondered about her significance there. And I really appreciated how she kind of talked about the history.
Yeah, so you're bringing up aspects that I think they're super important, so that people understand a little bit more about the play, because there are all these different characters there's a chorus made up of 5 actors who play many roles.
Yeah.
So one of the roles that has a very short appearance is Darwin. And the reason why I brought Darwin is because I read Darwin's survey of the islands when he was there. He writes a little bit about it, and he writes about one of the mammals that he found there that actually helped him form his theories. And so it's very significant actually for Darwin's theories, and it's significant because it takes place there. And so I used that animal. It's called the wara wolf. It's an animal that is now extinct. I used that moment, I guess, to highlight the fact that these islands that most people don't know about, most people don't even know where they are actually on the map of scientific thought of the 1800s, the 19th century. They have a significance that is universal, not just because of the war, but there's actually something from the natural world that is important. So I brought that character. It's also a very comedic moment. There's a lot of lightness on the play. There's a lot of moments of laughter and levity.
Yeah.
And I think that the Darwin moment is definitely one of those moments. And the boring school teacher is also meant to be a funny character. The description on the script is that there's a note that says, she's kind of like a parrot, she parrots things.
Right.
She's robotic, but she's meant to amuse audiences, not bore them.
Yeah.
So she's boring, but she's not supposed to bore you, right? And people actually found that when we did the workshop in 2019, we started workshopping this play, this script at ACT Theater, at the time where ACT had this ACT Lab program.
Yeah.
We did 3 nights with this workshop, and people found her to be very amusing. So the teacher is there as to highlight how important the islands, the national cause is for Argentines, for people who went to school in the 60s and 70s, how important it was for them, because it was kind of drilled into their heads, like, Malvinas son Argentinas. The Malvinas are Argentine, and you didn't really know why. It didn't matter. You just were told that they were Argentine, and therefore you had to defend them, and you had to be ready to even shed blood over them, which is nonsense. Nobody should be asked to shed blood over anything, like these islands or anything, really. In my opinion. So the teacher is there to highlight that, and at the same time to help the audience understand more about the history. So it's a device that allowed me as a playwright to tell the audience more about the history of the islands in a way that I wouldn't otherwise have really known how to do it.
Yeah,
right?
I thought it was really clever.
Right, a way of not being expository, but you're actually being expository because she's a teacher giving a lecture.
Yeah.
So that's the idea.
Yeah. I also appreciated how, it's a journey. Basically, the story is a journey about, and maybe it's not about this. Maybe I'm all wrong, but this is sort of what I've gathered from it. Is it's a journey about, finding yourself, facing your past, like you mentioned before, and healing.
Yeah. I think in that sense, it's a very uplifting play, and it's a story that people can relate to, whether they have any first-hand experience of war or not.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really about overcoming trauma and overcoming difficult moments of your past.
Yeah.
And making up your mind that you're going to do it. And, James doesn't fully make up his mind. It's more Henry pushing him.
Yeah.
And he gets a lot of help of people and creatures that he meets along the way.
Well, one thing before we close, I know we're kind of nearing an end, but I think there's one thing we forgot, just the importance of the 2 big black bags.
Yes. Yeah, the name of the play, which is a mouthful, and it's on purpose. I was just having fun when I decided how to name it.
Yeah.
It's based on the fact that following a drunken spree at the casino one night, James wakes up to 2 big black bags in his living room full of money, $10 million. So he doesn't know what to do. He's confused. He doesn't understand how he found these. Where did these bags come from? So he's at the same time experiencing a really difficult breakup with his wife, and he can't get his life together. Basically, he's a mess. And he decides to take these bags and run away. And so he decides to start driving. And he knows he wants to turn his life around. He knows he wants to be better. He knows he cares about his family. He knows that they can't live with him if he's an alcoholic and he's gambling all the time, but he doesn't know how.
Yeah.
So the bags are kind of a wake-up call, and I'm not going to spoil it.
Yes.
So people will find out what that's all about when they go to see the show. But yeah, he gets help from his alter ego. There are other characters, very important character, who is his grandma, who is basically the ghost of his Grandma Rose, who is his Irish grandma, because James is half Irish. And so there's he has a lot of help, which is basically his community is helping him. And so, I think there's a lot to relate to in this play.
Well, thank you so much, Julieta, for allowing me to interview you, talking about the documentary and the influence it's had on you writing the play. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, and I hope that people get to, not only to come see the show. We open on September 21st, and you can find all the information on our website at eseteatro.org. But they can also learn more if they go to our dramaturgy page. So Ese Teatro started doing dramaturgy for all of our shows so that our viewers are informed and they can expand and enrich their experience of the play. So basically this podcast as well is part of that.
Yeah.
But there's more information on the website, and there's a whole PDF packet that people can download. It's also going to be available in the lobby at West of Lenin when we open the show. And there's also a little 25-minute sort of, it's not quite a podcast, it's more like a video. I did a recording of myself talking about some of the issues that we discussed, but like I go more in depth into the documentary, and I talk more about the war, and I show images of the islands, and there's some really beautiful images that were taken during the filming of the documentary. So people are welcome to go and check that out as well. Yeah. And they can check out the movie La forma exacta de las Islas, the exact shape of the islands. It's linked on the website. And it has subtitles,
Yeah.
so they can go and watch it anytime.
Yeah, and I definitely think all of those are worth visiting. So
Yeah,
thank
we're
you
gonna
for
link
mentioning.
it too
Yeah.
on the YouTube, I'm sure.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa.
Okay.